it's of course a wonderful occasion to talk with Hermine again and with Nora this time. And we were just debating a little bit how to structure the talk, and of course our ambition is to make Hermine talk as much as possible. So as Nora and I will try to throw in some good questions your way and to hear what you have to say. And maybe we start with this most recent body of work. Most of these works are from 2018-19. Yet you titled the exhibition Toward the Beginning. Maybe you can talk about what circle is being closed here and why.
Well, it's interesting that you said what circles are being closed, because the circles are not closed.
Just the toward the beginning, I imagine, a round shape.
Okay. So what's your question, the title, Toward the
What
Beginning?
brings it together? So maybe to just give a little bit of background, these shaped canvases happened about 25, almost 30 years ago, this development.
Yes.
So I assume part of the title alludes to this kind of beginning of the body of work.
Actually, Stephanie, I think I was thinking more of going forward to something very ancient. I think that historians and archaeologists and so on are involved with the past, and they talk about going back, and they're going further and further into the past. But my experience of thinking about these things is that I'm not going backward, I'm going forward. And so it is a kind of a strange feeling, really. I mean, it seems to be two things opposed to each other, but I actually don't experience it that way myself. I experience that as I'm going towards something. And I guess I'm trying to do both. Bring stuff from the past forward and try to be now with it, yeah. We were just talking, the three of us, and I was reminding Nora of her beautiful essay in here where is that, Nora? Where she talks about the center and the edges facing towards each other. I haven't got that quite right, but
it's interesting I'm seeing this title as Moondial and sort of thinking about these pieces as something like timepieces or clocks in a way, even, because I like to think about painting as a clock, and there's this Philip Guston quote that I love, which he says, "Painting is a clock that sees each end of the street as the edge of the world." And that's something that really resonated for me when viewing your work, and thinking about the paintings almost as something that I was reading as a clock that, of course, is an impossible thing to read, because they're not really clocks, but in the one that I'm looking directly to in the back, almost has a sense that it is a kind of like timetable, or maybe something that has almost like a prehistoric feeling that this is something that could have told time for ancient people. I don't know.
Well, there is one painting that's very specifically about that, and it's the next to the last painting that I made. So it's not something that I started out with, and that's the painting called Moondial. And it's right on the back wall to the right there. And I had made a painting many, many years ago based on a mosaic sundial that's in a ruin outside of Rome, in the old port city of Rome. And I took a lot of pictures of it because it was very beautiful. It was also very wrecked, so there's a lot of things missing from it. But when I made this painting, it looked like a dial. It looked like a timepiece of some kind, as you've said. But it didn't look like the sun, it looked like the moon. And I live in the country in the summertime, and I like when the moon is full, the shadows that a moon shadows. And so I thought that it was not a sundial but a moon dial. I have no
That's
idea if anybody's ever used that as a made a moon dial, but yeah.
It makes a lot of sense. It has a logic, and I feel a lot of these pieces have a kind of a logic of their own, which makes me feel, as some of you are really, happy, joyful looking at that, and knowing that the work itself has its own internal logic. And that's something I also think is unusual and rare, too, to have pieces that have their own logic to them. That, of course, is an abstract logic, and yet it's really precise. I mean, there's even like this, where you're not going over, going to the edge, but the logic allows that.
We went to Rome for 4 months. We had been there before as tourists passing through, young people passing through. But my husband was invited to go to the American Academy in Rome starting in January following 9/11. So we left New York a few months after that, and we went to Rome, and I was very captivated. I was very taken with the idea of being in a city that had fallen down upon itself so many different times and resurrected itself from its own rubble so many times over the centuries. And I love that, and I felt comforted by it. A lot of people find Rome very depressing because it's full of ancient ruins and a gone past. And I had just the opposite, and I'm not alone in that. I found it very reassuring, very comforting to see the city thriving among its ruins. And one of the many things I loved about Rome was the way the early Christians, when they, for instance, built their churches, when you go to the porches of those ancient churches, a lot of you, I know, I've seen these, they would just pick up this stuff and slap it into the walls. And it's very irregularly shaped. It's very ancient. It's older than the Christian church itself. It's Roman, and sometimes it's even older. So I like the form of those pieces and how they were saved and revered in some way. And so that's where a lot of this started.
Well, there also is a rhythm, of course, between the past, the construction, the deconstruction, the rebuilding, building. Yeah. And you are very much interested in pattern of any sort. This is kind of a historic pattern that goes along with your interest in visual patterns, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I never really had I think the pattern, for me, the origin of this pattern making comes from developing a drawing mark when I first started to make art as an adult. I mean, I was one of those kids that made art growing up, and then I decided I wasn't going to be an artist, and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, but then when I did decide to be an artist, I made these drawings where I repeated a stroke. I was drawing from a landscape, but I wasn't making a picture of the landscape. I was interested in that. So when I started to do these mosaic pieces, sort of imitating broken mosaics and the irregularity of mosaics, and how they're repaired and their pieces missing and blah, blah, which happens very normally if you do this at a certain speed and don't go back and correct yourself too much. It's better. I felt like I had gone back 30 years to when I was making that drawing stroke. It kind of was strange how I went back. So there is a repetitive thing, and that is pattern making, But
and comfort, I think.
It
Just
is
going back to this
comforting.
story you told us about September 11th and how there was comfort
Yes,
in
absolutely.
being in a city like Rome.
Yes.
But there's a rhythm to life, of
Yes.
ongoing
Yes, that's right.
tide,
That's right.
tidal exchange, perhaps.
And it is a tidal. Tide is a good way of thinking about it.
Well, So perhaps in the making of it, is there a devotional aspect to the kind
What?
of, a devotional aspect perhaps to
Yeah.
the kind of, almost like a kind of, you're almost constructing it as you're building it, as you're painting it. I can tell, I can see kind of how you painted it, and it's extremely slow, careful, methodical space you're constructing, but then it's interrupted by these geometric forms, often triangles, which we know is a triangle is the strongest form possible. So that's really interesting to me spatially, because I'm thinking mosaic, I think floor. So I'm thinking like looking down at a floor, but then this geometric shape seems like it's
those are
completely
always-
outside of that.
Those are always part of the floor.
Yeah.
The floor is not an endless rows of little mosaics. It's very highly organized by geometry. You know, circles and segments of circles. And so but when you lift parts of it out of context, you know, by breaking it apart a little bit, then it becomes something very different, even though it echoes that.
We should probably not dwell too much on the source. That is a kind of a secondary aspect of the work that is interesting to know, but it doesn't really
Yes.
let us know what you are after, which is to kind of give us something that looks fragmented, but yet also feels cohesive. These are works that kind of hold together as something unified. I mean, I don't look at these and think these are forms that are tending to kind of fall apart. These are
That's
really
interesting because a
physical
lot of
structures.
people do. They think either way, one way or the other. They think. I've had people write to me and say, "Are you okay? It looks like everything's flying apart." And I say, "I'm fine. I think it's all coming
It's
together."
coming together. I'm going towards the end.
Right, exactly. You know, Stephanie, I have to say that one of the problems about talking about art is it's very stimulating for me to hear what you have to say, and I'm very interested in what you're saying, and also these are all legitimate things that we're talking about, like what I look at, what the sources are, what's kind of sets me off on this. But I can't really say that I'm sort of exploring this for myself. I don't really know exactly where I'm going and exactly what it's all about. I know that I need to set up a situation that will keep me interested in doing it. That's like that's the bottom line. And if I can do that, I have to somehow have confidence in it. Despite everything, you know, it's like jumping out of an airplane or something, hoping the parachute goes up.
But just to harken back at installation one more time, because it's a topic I'm always interested in. How do you go about conceiving the exhibition? Do you have a viewer in mind, how they're supposed to navigate this space? Because you create these focal points, you're not just hanging them side by side in a particular...
I'm really gratified actually to hear you say that, because in this show I came in here in the spring before leaving for the summer where I was going to continue to work, and I had a very clear idea about the exhibition, even though I hadn't made the last 3 paintings yet, but I had an idea to hang 2 large horizontal works on each end of the gallery. And that was really the starting point. And I wanted to show a few drawings, but not too many. And
in fact, you kind of stumble upon them.
yes.
You don't approach them from far away.
That's right.
It's kind of, you turn to the left and, there's a drawing that you want closer.
Yeah. I mean, I like the drawing. They do inform, I think they inform the work a bit, and they're like a nice foil in a way but I don't know, it fell into place very easily. It doesn't always happen that way. Sometimes you struggle, you know, and you change things around a lot, and it takes a long time to get it quite right. This particular exhibition came together quite easily.
So I think, you know, you are approaching the space with a sort of dramatic direction in the sense that you make our gaze go up and then further down. It's not a passive kind, I mean, viewing is never passive, hopefully, but it's not just, you know, turn in 360 degrees and take on a room. I have to go up, I have to go down. And it's hard for me to imagine that this comes just spontaneously, that you didn't have an intention of somehow choreographing our gaze.
Okay, so I do tend to hang paintings a little higher than they normally are, but that's not the way I work on them.
How come?
Well, I do eventually because I have to reach them. I have to have, you know.
So you mean in the studio and concentrate.
In the studio, I have to be able to reach them. I mean, sometimes I work on the tops of them. I'm on a ladder, but I have, you know. The small paintings is a different story because I, for many, many years, have made a variety of kinds of very small paintings. And originally, I just started stacking them on a wall just to get them out of the way. You know, I mean, I wanted to be able to look at them, but if I hung them, I wouldn't have had any wall space for working, so I would just designate a wall and I'd just stack them. And that was very entertaining for me. So I've shown small paintings in this kind of scatter thing several times over the years. And
so it's a little bit of a reflection of your studio. Yeah, the audience can imagine a little bit your own.
And also,
daily
you know,
viewing experience.
it's so natural to have the stars a little bit. And by the way, I did not set out to make stars. I was looking at this is kind of getting into the weeds a little bit, but I came across these 18th century engravings of a well-known mathematician at the time. Of course, I had never heard of this person, but who made these drawings of spheres, breaking them down further and further and further until there were like 1,000 tiny parts. It was fascinating, you know, because these weird dwarfed shapes were there, especially because he was turning them in space. And so I took them apart. I started isolating parts of them. And the spaces in between is what the stars are. I mean, originally I was looking at the other shapes and the spaces in between, so I kind of fell into the star thing, and at first I was quite horrified.
Why?
Well, the first pattern that I made, that I used the star thing, it was very much more regular. You know, the star shapes were very regular, and I actually made a painting that's kind of interesting. I've never shown it. And I made a bunch of drawings and paintings like this where the star was, you know, very regular and repeated, you know, a lot. And then I thought, hey, you know, I wonder if I could just draw this freehand, what it would look like. So I started, you know, on large sheets of just white paper with charcoal, I started drawing it freehand, and I like the idea of making the stars really irregular. And of course that made the inside shapes really irregular also. And then I just kind of, you know, played around with it, and I liked the unexpectedness of it. You can't really quite tie it down. You're not really sure exactly.
You know, a lot of the work has a kind of, feels almost like it's cut paper, like when you're a child and you're cutting out something, making a collage, and you can tell, especially on this piece, like the kind of irregularity of the edge line, which I think is really beautiful and contributes a lot. That the edge and the center, this we were talking about in the beginning, the edge and the center are in a kind of conjunction together. That the edge, the hand, and then
The outside edge of the painting, you
Yes,
mean, and the edge of the forms that are inside.
Yeah, the edge of the forms, the outside edge, that like sort of like everything is considered, and that's something that is, I think, happening in each work. But
These shapes are a little bit different from the star shapes, although there's a relationship in that I kind of got interested in a kind of crazy or wrong geometry, like a kind of geometry that couldn't actually exist in the world. And of course, as an artist, I am free to invent whatever shape I want, but they did come out of a real geometric form, but I kind of eliminated them or turned them in space in a weird way so they no longer reflected the real geometry. And I'm kind of intrigued by that.
it's maybe like two halves that aren't meeting, or they're meeting, but
I
not.
know, Also, they're so foreign. I have made a number of paintings over the years where I thought that this weird shape was like an asteroid hitting the Earth, that it was kind of like some kind of weird impact, like so you'd find something on the ground, you couldn't figure out where it came from. Is this man-made or natural or what? One time we found a bomb on our beach, right? And
It's a shell.
a shell, yeah, like a big thing. It was like this big. And we called the Mounties and called big to do. It's kind of like the way I think of these things in a way. I mean, it's not a direct. I'm not making a picture of that, but it's that kind of experience.
It's like an unidentified object.
Yes, an
Perhaps
unidentified
cosmic.
object that's like a surprise.
Yeah.
Like, what is this? It's some kind of phenomena that isn't readily explained.
I mean, that's why these somewhat stars, not really stars, because these are kind of edging into a territory where they're kind of being read as stars, but also not.
Good, I'm glad to hear you say that.
But these, even those are not stars exactly.
Dodged a bullet.
Yeah.
I would also be interested to hear you talk a little bit about dichotomy. You have the macro, micro, you have the kind of natural color and artificial colors, like this kind of, almost acidic green.
Oh yes, I love that question.
The kind of geometric, not biomorphic shapes necessarily, but the rounded forms. So obviously there's a lot of
There's a very
tension between extremes.
Yes, and it goes very, 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 very far back. And to tell you the truth, I haven't made that connection to this lately, but it does go very, very far back in that I mentioned before that when I first thought seriously I might really be an artist, I was drawing, making. So I had decided I was not going to be an artist. I came from a family of artists. I was married to an artist. There was entirely too many artists in my family. And so I thought, I'm not going to be an artist. I'm going to be a nursery school teacher. So, but I had a small child, and we went to a dune shack behind the town of Provincetown. Some of you might be familiar with those. And we had to carry everything across the dunes. And we were out there, and we had this little child, and I said to I really just wanted some time off, a few hours every day, So I told my husband, I'm going to have 3 hours every day and do whatever I want. And I had brought a drawing pad with me, which is really weird. I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it. Anyway, I went out into the dunes every day, and I started drawing the grass on the dunes, and immediately I eliminated the horizon line. Because I wasn't interested in making a realistic picture of it, but I was interested in observing the grass very carefully. So it was very upfront, and it eliminated right there and then, even though I was drawing on a square piece of paper, that is the origin actually of eliminating the square edge in a funny way, because
And the context.
And the context. So I made those drawings, and then one thing led to another, and the first paintings I made were actually on paper too. And I would divide the paper in half. This is the origin of making separate parts and fitting them together. I would divide the paper in half, and I would make this dune. I mean, nobody could identify that as a dune, but this stroke, it was definitely related to nature, and it kind of had, the gray of the graphite. It was kind of like this gray, misty sea kind of atmospheric. Mm-hmm. And then on the other side of the page, I painted a flat green, which I tried. This was like a long journey. The shack that we were living in was like this bleached gray wood, but the window frames were painted this very unnatural kind of green. I was very interested in the fact that there could be a green that was completely artificial looking. And that was like a foil, those two things. And I'm telling you this story while I'm looking at behind Chuck's head back there, that green. Because it's come back over and over again to have a kind of unnatural or kind of artificial kind of thing enter into it, as it does in our world. I mean, this is what I meant before when I said I think of myself in some ways as a realist, because the experience is so real for me, And anyway, I hope that answers your question a little bit.
It does a little. You always leave room for some mystique, which I love. In fact, when we had our conversation in 2014, which I was lucky to write down,
I want to say, Stephanie has put together these amazing books.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And Hermine was one of the first artists to be interviewed, actually, which was wonderful. But one of the things you said that has always stuck with me is that, to make art, you don't have an easy access to all these layers of experiences and interests. It's not something that's on the surface. What comes out might reflect all these things you've accumulated, but it's not something that you can access with an idea.
Yeah. For me, it isn't.
I had never heard it put that way, but of course it makes sense.
Yeah.
It's just a knowledge base and a well.
I think you teach yourself. An artist teaches themselves something in making the work. In a way, that's what we're doing. You teach yourself first, and then maybe there's a few other people.
Would you say that making work always starts with curiosity about an object, or be it like how the structure of a grass stalk is made, that you kind of try to observe and examine it? Is it a part of it getting to know the subject better for you?
Yeah, but it isn't quite that straightforward. You kind of fall in love with certain things, like the beach stones from my beach. And they sit around for years, and then one day you decide, oh, it would be fun to make a drawing of that, like a really realistic drawing of that. And then, this happened to me. Then I started making a kind of practice in my studio where every day I would warm up, and and it was ridiculous because I was making these big abstract paintings, and I was making these little drawings like that, and I was erasing, and so I spent a lot of time looking at the stones, and the stones mimic, as they do. I don't know how many of you have ever thought of this before, but they mimic the things in the larger landscape. The stones are the shape of the little island that's off our shore. They're shaped like whales. They have all these other, it's kind of, what do you call that in nature? Like what cauliflower is.
Mimesis?
No, there's a geometry word.
Fractal geometry.
There you go, fractal. It's like that, like this little beach pebble. And then sometimes they have, like a river thing going through them, so there's a whole river system there, and this led to all kinds of things, because then I was looking at maps of bird flyways, diagrams, and that looks like a river, so it's kind of macro and then micro map, and explain how it comes together in the work, or what you choose, like to follow. And also, I make a number of these things. There's a lot of variations, and I'm curious, so I do a whole bunch of them, and then at some point, I think, well, maybe I'll do this other thing, bring this other thing in. I mean, I have a lot of material. I have like endless material now to draw on. But before that, I just want to say something else too. I think that for a lot of artists, the attraction to the physical material is the thing that gets you going.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you want to dip your brush in paint, and what are you going to do after that? So you have to come up with something, but maybe the greatest interest and the greatest love of all is just that, an excuse to do that.
You talked a little bit about the studio and having work out. Do they all build on top of each other?
Yeah, I think one leads to the other, definitely.
Do you
Oh,
see,
absolutely.
not just, obviously there's no narrative in that sense, but is there a narrative in your head?
No, it's just one leads to the other. So I don't have a narrative, a big narrative.
I mean, do you have a relationship between this piece and the small piece? Are there stories in your head how you connect them? Or is it more a formal connection, that they build on each other structurally and in terms of
I
palette?
can't even remember. This is the earliest piece in the show. And these came quite a bit after, like at least a year afterwards. So I don't really, sometimes I just like to make smaller paintings. It's kind of a mini vacation. And I can kind of wrap my arms around them.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then they just look so nuts to me in a way. I mean, the shape, I could never design that out of my head on my own. It's kind of like a found thing. I've set it up so that I kind of stumble onto it. And,
You mean like the shape of the outside of the painting is kind of like a found shape for you that's determined by.
well, let's
the
see. I
shapes
think
inside of
I
it?
think I drew the stars first. I've kind of given up trying not to call them stars.
Well, in a way, it's interesting we keep calling it a star because stars, of course, are not really there.
That's right.
But this star shape that's a symbol. That's an abstraction.
It's a
So
geometric thing. It's not. Doesn't
That's
exist
kind of
yet.
very interesting to think about.
Yeah, it is.
It's just a
Yeah.
little bead of light that actually is not even there anymore. It's also interesting looking at this piece over there. It feels like there's a kind of internal light source too, which I didn't even really notice until I was in front of it looking at it. But it's almost as if the pigment in the color geometric triangle block shapes is in a way lighting the mosaic form, which to me felt almost like a kind of internal radiance, like the light is kind of moving from the center.
Well, in that painting, I really was determined to not paint completely densely, to make a thinner layer of color so that some lighter stuff would come through, and other areas are more opaque. The mosaic part of the paintings, I start the paintings. The way I start them is that they're on the floor, and I make very thin washes of paint with turpentine, but it's really, really thin, and it's like I'm a color field painter. I kind of splash it around and throw it around, because I don't want to organize it too much. I just want to discolor the ground. And I kind of impose something on it because sometimes I want it to be a variety of color. Like I want it to be sure that it's not all gray, or that some of it is much darker than others. So I kind of play around with it. And then when it's dry and I start to make that pattern, I never know what's in the negative, what color is in the negative space. So it's really fun for me to do it because I'm continually, you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
You
I do.
understand? Yeah.
So
So,
the pattern is a joy, not a chore.
well, yeah, oh, no, it's totally fun to do. I mean, oh yeah, I just zone out, when I'm doing it. But when I'm, and I'm very close to it, I do that part on the tabletop. So I'm leaning over it. But what I'm trying to describe is that in between those little squares, the ground color is not the same everywhere. So it influences, there's a shift in color underneath. And so that is a surprise to me because I haven't planned and further than that. I just know that I want it to change from one part of the painting to the other.
I think that's really interesting. It's like your paintings are guided both by these ideas we've been talking about, but also equally sensation, and that one isn't dominant over the other. And I think that is what makes the work, I think, kind of unique today. Oftentimes artists will have maybe heavier on sensation or really heavier on the idea of it, the logic of it, the mathematics of it. And if you're able to really have both, I think that's what these works reveal.
I'm not capable of being completely logical. I mean that. It sounds funny, but I really sincerely mean that. I just can't do it mentally.
That's good.
Does the work look very different to you in the space than it has in the studio? Is there a remove as soon as it leaves the building? Or does your look at it change?
I don't really know how to answer that, Stephanie. I must say, I have to admit that I was quite dazzled by it after I put it up. I can't see it all at once in my studio. So that was a treat for me.
Well, in a way, the fragments become a whole.
Yeah, it's true.
An environment,
Yeah.
And what's happening in the studio now that the work is gone? Since you usually have it up.
Yeah,
Or
I
some of
usually
it.
have some of it up and stuff going on. It's, as some of you know, it's very distracting to have a show up. And fortunately, I had all these panels, all these impeachment hearings. But in the last few days, there's one more week left of the show, and in the last few days, I've kind of been getting ready to go back to work. I'm eager to go back to work, and I'm looking forward to it.
Do you think you will build on this body of
Oh
work?
yeah, I have, look, I have like 1,000 ideas. There's something, I have a stack of little drawings I made over the summer, and I'm eager to get going on. Yeah.
Maybe it would be nice to hear what the audience has
Sure.
to say or questions you might have. Maybe it's an opportune moment to pass around the mic or just turn it around. Should we maybe it's you know the acoustics better. Maybe it's so loud when you move it.
Yeah,
It's self-conscious.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about the paint you put on the surfaces. Would you talk a little bit about how the surfaces begin? They are sculptures in a sense.
Sure.
Do you make them first, and what are you thinking about as you make them?
Okay, so I make a lot of drawings of all sizes. I make little kind of work drawings. I make a lot of drawings, and I try not to censor them too much. I mean, some of them will become making paintings, but I'll, and then I get kind of focused on one thing. I think that would be fun to make a painting of this. So then I draw to scale on large sheets of butcher paper. I just it's like I'm making a dress pattern. I draw the whole thing out. I cut it out. First, I mark the horizontal bar, because if I don't do that right away, it's a disaster. Then I have to guess what it is. And then I have these huge panels of laminate stuff. And I gesso linen onto that, and it's amazing how easy it is to do that. I couldn't believe it just goes down like a dream, and it glues it and flat. It's very easy to get it, pull it flat. And so I covered the whole panel in gesso. I spread the linen out on top of it.
So the gesso is like a glue.
So the gesso acts as a glue. And then, so it goes down flat, and then the first layer of gesso goes on top. So it's wet on the bottom, it's wet on the top. And so that's what I start with. Then when that's dry, I turn it over, just like you would cut out a dress pattern. I take the paper pattern and I cut it out on the back so that it's...
So you like trim the edges. You kind of
No, first I have to draw it out. Right? I have to, I put the paper pattern down on the back and I draw around it. I mark where the horizontal hanging bar is, so I don't lose track of that. And then I cut the whole thing out with a jigsaw. And that's it. I put a few more coats of gesso on top, the way painters do.
But they're hanging flush on the wall.
There's just they are so primitive. I'm embarrassed when,
And don't give away all your secrets.
when they go out into the world, people sometimes call me up and they say, "Isn't there a hanging bar? What is this?" And I say, "No, just put 2 screws in the wall and it'll tuck right in."
Oh, you've like gouged out.
I routed it out.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So there's no carpentry back there at all. They're a little fragile, actually.
They're lighter than they seem.
And yes, that's right.
It's great.
Suzanne.
I just have a little question regarding that. Do you ever get a certain way on a painting and think, oh, I wish this weren't sticking out there, I'd like to cut back into it?
It's not that I have a rule against it. I don't think there's anything wrong in doing that, but I have very rarely, I'd rather fix it a different way. I'd rather insist on it,
Right.
A different way than cutting it off but I have once or twice done that.
So when you got to that shack and were drawing the grass, which is like drawing life as it forms and unforms, and which so many of the things you describe, drawing or painting, are like. But the grass was drawn in graphite, but the paint was green. Now you're talking about that green is artificial, but at some point it must have seemed that half of the picture was a drawing of grass and the other half was a color of grass, and that you were separating the two components by which grass might be depicted.
I could have been a really good landscape artist, and I love great landscape painting. I like great realism of all kinds, as most of us do. But I didn't want to do it. I didn't want to do it, and so I needed a foil for that very romantic part of the page. That was this kind of seascape,
Right.
gray, and so I needed a foil for it.
I actually have a question, Hermine.
Yeah.
So a lot of what you're saying about Rome and sort of the rebuilding and reuse of material reminds me a lot of this building. And for those of you that don't know, this building originated as 8 separate buildings that were townhouses and stables behind carriage houses. They were then turned into artist studios, and then Gertrude Venerable Whitney turned into the Whitney Museum, and then it was sort of abandoned, and then the studio schools moved in, and now it's this flourishing art school. So in a way, it feels sort of like the perfect venue for your work. And so I'm wondering how it feels to be in this gallery and be in a space that was part of the original Whitney Museum. This is very much what it looked like when it was the Whitney This Room.
Rachel, you don't know the half of it.
Her father was.
Yeah, he signed the,
His memorial was in that room, but
he's on the founding manifesto, his
Yeah.
signature.
But I haven't myself had a huge relationship with the New York Studio School at all. I did give a talk here once many, many years ago. Graham has been supportive for a very, very long time. But it's, in a way, it's kind of coincidence. I mean, there isn't a logical reason why but I do like very, very much the idea of having a show here. I remember this building from my childhood, you know. Then my early childhood, I remember when the early Whitney was here. And then also as I grew up, 8th Street was like a mecca for teenagers. We used to hang out here. We used to hang out in Washington Square Park. So I have a long history with the neighborhood and with this building. So it is very, very nice for me to have the show here. And I'd like to thank Graham for making it possible. And you.
We're happy to have you. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, okay.
I would like you to explain a little more about choice of color, because what I see, there's a naturalistic color, and then there's artificiality.
Yes.
So there's a sort of interesting dynamics.
Yes. Yes. Well, yes, that's right. I'm glad you see that. And I explained a little bit about this before when I talked about I think the very first time that I consciously did that was in these dune drawings that they weren't in the original dune drawings, but as I developed that. You know, what happened is I made those drawings in the dunes, and then I came back to the city, and I thought, I want to keep working. And this is after I had decided I wasn't going to be an artist. I think I needed to do that, you know. Well, what am I going to do? I'm not going to just go to Central Park and set my easel. So I began to make this situation that I described, where I divided the paper in half. Eventually, I made paintings where there were 5 rectangles. It was divided into 5 segments. So I've been segmenting work for a very, very, very long time. Even though the outer edge was rectangular for a long time, it was divided inside. And there would be a different situation in each box, so to speak, that was both very contrary to the one next to it, but then maybe echoed something at the other end, so that there was a difference and a sameness that were kind of, I don't know, maybe almost like a choreography, you know.
Interesting to hear you talk about this, that you, in the beginning, segmented things.
Yes.
And now you're bringing segments together.
Yes,
It's almost
no,
a reversal of practice.
But yes, but they were always together. They never completely fell apart. But actually it's interesting. I thought of it as I wanted, and in some paintings more than others, I'm thinking way back. I wanted a painting that looked like it was just about to fly apart, or that something was just about to fall off, and at the last minute it was saved. I think that's an experience we can all relate to. I don't know.
I'm glad you used that word choreography because I don't see stars of it. I just see things dancing. all
The
over
original
place.
stars, the original star figure were like dancers.
Yeah, well, they still seem to be pretty much
They were very
dancing off
much,
of
yeah.
there.
Yeah. And actually that was a problem, just the way, it took me a while to accept the stars. I didn't really want to make dancing figures. But,
Oh,
you know, okay, there they were.
yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
You know, Hermine, on what you were just saying about things falling off and such, I can't tell if they're hovering or floating or invading. Do you,
That's good.
that
Sounds perfect.
What do you
I
have
think
a?
they're all of those. I mean, what you're saying is that they're not fixed.
No.
So that's good.
Anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for coming.